On the morning of June the 9th, 1798, a man stood on the walls of a fortress that had never been taken by force and watched the horizon disappear behind masts. Ferdinand von Hompesch zu Bolheim had been Grand Master of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta for barely a year. He was not a man who inspired legends, not the sort of figure around whom stories calcified into myth, and history would not be kind to him. But on that June morning, as the sails of the French Republic's Mediterranean fleet crowded the waters around his island, 400 ships, 50,000 soldiers, the most powerful army on earth, he would have understood, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, the precise nature of the problem he had inherited. The order had held Malta for 268 years. It had held Rhodes before that for more than 2 centuries. Before Rhodes, it had held the castles of the Crusader kingdom, the citadels of the Holy Land, and the greatest hospital the medieval world had ever built. In 1565, on this very island, a Grand Master named Jean Perisseau de Valette had stood against an Ottoman fleet of perhaps 200 ships and an army of approximately 40,000 men, and had held them off for 113 days. The whole of Christian Europe had celebrated that victory. Church bells rang in Rome. Philip II of Spain wept in his chapel. The order was spoken of in the same breath as the walls of Constantinople, as Rhodes itself, as the great immovable things of the ancient world. Hompesch had, at best, 332 knights available to him. The French fleet anchored. Napoleon's emissaries presented their demands. Small engagements broke out around the island's perimeter. Actual fighting, brief and scattered, the kind of resistance that allowed a man to say afterward that he had tried. And within 48 hours, the island that had survived Suleiman the Magnificent, that had broken the great Ottoman tide, surrendered. The sovereign military order of Malta was homeless, and yet it still exists today. It issues passports. It receives ambassadors. It maintains diplomatic relations with more than 114 countries. Its head of state holds the rank of a cardinal of the Catholic Church and the title of a sovereign prince simultaneously. It operates from 2 buildings in Rome, 2 buildings that are, under Italian law and international agreement, not Italian territory, and it is recognized by the United Nations as a sovereign entity. It has no army. It has no navy. It has no country. It has been this way for nearly 200 years. The question that June morning in 1798 poses is not simply how an institution loses an island. The question is how it survives the loss, how a military order with no military capability becomes a recognized nation with no territory, how something that by every conventional measure should have dissolved into history instead dissolved itself into something stranger and in many ways more durable than anything it had been before. That is the story of the sovereign military order of Malta, and it begins not with knights or castles or wars, but with merchants and a hospital and a city that had not yet fallen. The order is, depending on how you count it, somewhere between 900 and nearly 1,000 years old. Its precise origins sit in a period before the First Crusade, in the years when Christian pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem in such numbers that the infrastructure required to receive them strained every institution that had agreed to provide it. The formal name, in full, is the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta, a name that is itself a compressed history, a list of the places the order has been and lost. And embedded in that name is a truth that most of what is written about it tends to obscure. The word that comes first, before military, is hospitaller. Before the swords and the fortresses and the diplomatic passports, there was a hospital. The most striking documented fact about this institution is not its sovereignty or its intelligence-adjacent reputation, or the conspiracy theories that cling to it in every dark corner of the internet. It is this: the Sovereign Military Order of Malta maintains formal diplomatic relations with more than 114 sovereign states, more than many actual United Nations member nations, operates from two buildings in Rome that are legally not Italian territory, and is currently headed by a man who holds the rank of cardinal and the title of head of state at the same time. It has no army, it has no navy, it has no country, and it has existed continuously and without interruption for over 900 years. That is the thing that nothing in the popular telling quite prepares you for. Not the conspiracy theories, which are colorful but largely false, not the chivalric mythology, which is romantic but incomplete. The documented record, stripped of embellishment, is strange enough. The city of Jerusalem in the middle of the 11th century was a contested, complicated, exhausting place to run a charity. It was under Fatimid rule. The Shia Caliphate based in Cairo had taken the city in 969 and held it with varying degrees of stability ever since, and the conditions for Christian pilgrims were neither uniformly hostile nor reliably safe. The population of European Christians making the overland or sea journey to the holy sites had grown substantially through the 10th and 11th centuries, and the demand for housing, medical care, and basic support for sick or destitute travelers had outpaced what the existing Byzantine and Armenian Christian institutions could manage. Sometime around the year 1048, the order's own tradition holds this date, and most scholarly sources accept it as approximately correct, though some prefer a slightly later estimate nearer to 1080 for when the institution becomes clearly documented. A group of merchants from the maritime Republic of Amalfi negotiated permission from the Fatimid authorities in Cairo to construct a hospital in Jerusalem for the benefit of Christian pilgrims. The hospital was dedicated to St. John the Baptist. It was not a military establishment. It was not a secret one. It was a charity operated by monks, funded by donations from Amalfi and from the traveling Christians who passed through its wards and survived. The man who ran it in the decades before and immediately after the First Crusade was known as Blessed Gerard. Almost nothing is known with certainty about his origins. The sources call him by various surnames, Sasso or Tinque, and place his birth somewhere in the Italian peninsula or possibly Provence, though neither identification rests on solid evidence. He is described universally as the rector of the hospital, the administrator who built it into something substantial enough to receive papal recognition. He was, by any measure, a man of genuine organizational capacity, operating in conditions of significant political volatility. On July 15, 1099, the army of the First Crusade breached the walls of Jerusalem. The slaughter that followed was extensive and documented in excruciating detail by contemporaries on both sides. But Gerard's hospital, through some combination of institutional neutrality, practical necessity, and diplomatic intelligence, continued to operate. It treated Crusader soldiers. It treated pilgrims, wealthy European nobles, flushed with the violent euphoria of conquest and possessed of a theological need to demonstrate piety, poured donations into the hospital with extraordinary generosity. Within months of the fall of Jerusalem, the institution that Blessed Gerard had been quietly running for decades became one of the most substantially endowed charitable organizations in the Christian world. The church moved quickly to formalize what the donor's money had already made real. On the 15th of February, 1113, Pope Paschal II issued a papal bull known by its opening words, Pie Postulatio Voluntatis. The document is the constitutive founding document of everything that followed: the castles, the knights, the fleet, the passports, the two buildings in Rome where ambassadors are received today. The bull formally recognized the Hospital of St. John as a distinct religious order, placed it under the direct protection of the Holy See, and granted it something of extraordinary importance: the right to elect its own superiors, free from the interference of either secular authority or local church hierarchy. The hospital answered directly to Rome and to no one else. That grant of independence from local bishops would matter in ways that Paschal II could not possibly have imagined nearly 900 years later. Gerard died on the 3rd of September, 1120. He had led the hospital through the chaos of the First Crusade, through the transformation from a quiet Amalfi-funded charity into a papally recognized institution of international standing, and had lived long enough to see the donations of a generation of guilty conquerors turn his ward beds into something approaching permanence. He was beatified by the Catholic Church, not fully canonized, but recognized as blessed, and is commemorated to this day. His successor was Raymond du Puy de Provence, and Raymond had different ideas. The militarization of the Order of St. John was not a sudden transformation. It was a gradual institutional evolution driven by the specific pressures of the Crusader state, which required military force as desperately as it required medicine, and which had in the Order of St. John an organization with resources, organization, and an established infrastructure that the fractious, underfunded Crusader kingdom could not easily replicate. Raymond drafted the first formal rule of the order, around 1121, adding a class of knight brothers to the existing hospitaller monks and establishing a dual vocation, care for the sick, war for the faith, that would define the institution for the next several centuries. The logic was, in its context, not difficult to follow. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was a thin strip of territory surrounded by larger and eventually more powerful polities, held by a settler population that was numerically small, politically divided, and dependent on a steady stream of European reinforcements that was never quite steady enough. An order of military monks who could garrison fortresses without needing to be paid wages, who could enforce discipline without the political complications of feudal obligation, and who could receive donations from across Europe without being subject to the property laws of any single kingdom. Such an organization was, for the Kingdom of Jerusalem, nearly ideal. The order took on major fortresses. Crac de Chevalier, the great castle in what is now western Syria, passed to Hospitaller control in 1142 and remained in their hands until 1271, 129 years, during which it was expanded, reinforced, and never successfully taken by assault. They garrisoned Belvoir, Belmont, and a network of smaller castles across the kingdom. They ran the largest hospital in the Holy Land, which by the peak of the Crusader period was receiving up to 2,000 patients and was staffed with physicians drawing salaries comparable to those of senior court officials. A clarification is necessary here because the confusion between two military orders is both common and consequential for what comes later in this story. The Knights Hospitaller, the Order of St. John, and the Knights Templar were separate institutions, founded at different times, with different organizational structures, different rules, and different fates. The Templars were established around 1119, and they were dissolved by papal decree in 1312, suppressed, their leaders burned, their assets redistributed, their name erased from official Catholic recognition. The Hospitallers acquired some Templar properties after the dissolution. There is no organizational continuity, no shared ritual, no documented founding connection between the two orders. The popular conflation of them is a modern error, compounded by decades of novels and internet forums that treat medieval military orders as a single interchangeable phenomenon. The Templars are gone, the Hospitallers are not. By the late 13th century, the Crusader project was failing. The order relocated its headquarters progressively westward along the coast, following the shrinking perimeter of what could still be held. The fall of Acre in 1291 ended it. When Acre fell to the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil after a siege of 6 weeks, the surviving Hospitallers evacuated by sea. The order went first to Cyprus, where it remained for nearly 2 decades in a condition of strategic uncertainty, a military organization without a front, a Hospitaller order without its hospital, a Catholic institution watching its purpose dissolve into the Mediterranean horizon. Cyprus was temporary. Everyone understood that. The question was what came next. The answer came in the form of an island. Rhodes sits at the southwestern tip of what is now Turkey, a large and mountainous island with a deep harbor and a strategic position that the medieval mind understood immediately. Whoever held Rhodes held the eastern Mediterranean shipping lanes, or at least held a very pointed knife at them. The Order of St. John took the island in 1310 after a campaign against its Byzantine and then Genoese rulers, and immediately began the work of transformation. They fortified the city, they built a fleet, they became, over the following 2 centuries, something that their founders in Jerusalem could not have easily imagined: a naval power, a maritime republic in miniature, policing and occasionally terrorizing the trade routes of the Levant. The Knights of Rhodes, as they became known, were simultaneously a religious order and a piratical enterprise, defenders of Christian commerce in one breath and raiders of Muslim shipping in the next, an arrangement that generated enormous revenues and implacable enemies in roughly equal measure. They were attacked in 1480 by an Ottoman fleet that outnumbered them dramatically, and they held. The siege lasted weeks. The defenders improvised, counterattacked, endured losses that would have broken most garrisons, and eventually the Ottoman force withdrew. The victory was celebrated across Catholic Europe as proof of the order's peculiar dispensation, not merely military competence, but something that observers in an age of genuine faith read as divine favor. 40 years later, the Ottoman Empire returned. In the summer of 1522, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who would later, in 1565, dispatch his fleet toward Malta, arrived at Rhodes with a force that modern estimates place at considerably more than 70,000 men. The Grand Master at the time was Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, a Frenchman of considerable personal courage and uncertain strategic options. The order had fewer than 500 knights and perhaps 4,000 soldiers and militia. The siege lasted 6 months, from June through December of 1522, and it was conducted by the Ottomans with a systematic, professional thoroughness that the 1480 attackers had lacked. Trenches advanced. Mines were dug under the walls. Breaches were opened, closed, and opened again. In December, L'Isle Adam made the decision that history would debate for centuries afterward. He negotiated surrender. Suleiman, who was documented as having expressed genuine admiration for the defenders' resistance, offered terms that were, by the standards of 16th century siege warfare, remarkably generous. The knights, the soldiers, and any civilian who wished to leave could depart freely with their arms, their possessions, and their archives. They had 12 days. They left. And for 8 years, the Order of St. John wandered. L'Isle Adam appealed to every Catholic monarch in Europe for a base of operations. He was received with sympathy, offered hospitality, and given no territory. The order moved through Sicily, through Viterbo, through Nice, carrying its archives and its traditions and the bones of its saints from one temporary refuge to the next, a sovereign institution without even the fiction of a state, a military order with no fortress to defend. The solution, when it came, arrived wrapped in an insult. In 1530, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V offered the Order of St. John a permanent base, the island of Malta, together with the smaller island of Gozo and the North African city of Tripoli. The annual rent was precisely 1 Maltese falcon, to be delivered each year on All Saints' Day to the Viceroy of Sicily. A falcon for an island. Charles was simultaneously solving a strategic problem. He needed someone to garrison and defend Malta, which sat astride the central Mediterranean at enormous cost to maintain, and disposing of an inconvenient institution that had been petitioning him for a decade. He was, in a sense, paying the order to do work he needed done anyway, and paying them with someone else's real estate. The order accepted. They spent the next decades fortifying what they had been given, turning Malta's natural harbors into one of the most heavily defended naval installations in the Mediterranean, and waiting. They understood, as L'Isle Adam understood, that the island's value was defensive and that eventually the Ottomans would come again. In the spring of 1565, they did. The Great Siege of Malta is one of the most documented military events of the 16th century, and it is documented, at least in part, because an eyewitness wrote it down. Francisco Balbi di Correggio, a Spanish soldier who fought in the siege, published his account in 1568, 3 years after the events he described. and his narrative, detailed, immediate, sometimes openly partisan, but cross-referenced by other sources, is the primary eyewitness record. The numbers he and other contemporaries cite vary somewhat, but the scholarly consensus places the Ottoman force at approximately 40,000 men and roughly 200 ships. Against this, the order had approximately 700 knights and perhaps 8,000 Maltese soldiers, militia, and civilian defenders. The Grand Master was Jean Parisot de Valette. He was in his 70s. He had joined the Order of St. John as a young man and had spent his life in its service. He had been captured by Ottoman corsairs in his 30s and spent a year as a galley slave before being ransomed, an experience that left him with no illusions about what he was defending against or what capture would mean. He was not a man given to inspirational speeches, at least not on the evidence of the historical record, though later tradition would supply him with several. What the record does establish is that when his council suggested an orderly retreat to the better fortified Fort St. Angelo, he refused. He would die in the breach if the breach came. The knights would stay. The Ottoman commanders began the assault on May 18, 1565. What followed was 113 days of a siege that consumed men, materiel, and morale in quantities that stagger the imagination even at 5 centuries removed. The Ottomans took the small fort of St. Elmo after 31 days of assault, losing enormous numbers doing it. Some sources claim more casualties at St. Elmo than at the entire crusade of 1522. When the fort fell, the Ottoman commander Mustafa Pasha reportedly stared across the harbor at the much larger Fort St. Angelo and said, according to one account, that if such a small son had cost so dear, what would the father cost? It was a fair question. The siege continued through a Maltese summer of extraordinary heat, with water rationing, disease, and sorties that exhausted both sides. At several points, the order's position appeared genuinely desperate. At several points, the Maltese population fought alongside the knights with a commitment that the order's own chronicles record with evident surprise and gratitude. On September 7th, a relief force finally arrived from Sicily, 8,000 Spanish and Italian soldiers, and the Ottoman command, already ravaged by months of casualties and dysentery, made the decision to withdraw. They were gone by September 8th. The news traveled across Catholic Europe with a velocity that the 16th century rarely achieved for anything except catastrophe. The Order of St. John had held. The knights who had surrendered Rhodes 43 years earlier had redeemed themselves, if redemption was the correct theological category, in blood and stone. Pope Pius IV declared the victory an act of divine providence. Responses from courts across Europe arrived in Malta within weeks, and the Grand Master de Valette began planning the construction of a new city, a city that would bear his name, that would become the capital of Malta, and that stands today as one of the most beautifully preserved Baroque fortification complexes in the world, Valletta, built by a man in his 70s after the greatest military victory of his life, who would live only 3 more years to see it rise. The Battle of Lepanto came 6 years later, in October 1571, when the Holy League, an alliance of Spain, Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, and the Order of Malta, among others, confronted the Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Patras. The order contributed ships and personnel. The Ottoman fleet was defeated. It was the largest naval battle in the Mediterranean since antiquity, and it marked a turning point in Ottoman naval expansion, though the empire would remain a major power for centuries more. The order participated in the victory and recorded it in its chronicles with understandable pride. And then, slowly, inexorably, the institution began to drift. The 18th century was not kind to military orders founded on crusade theology. The intellectual world had moved. The Enlightenment was dissolving the foundations on which such institutions justified themselves. Divine mandate, crusading purpose, the theological necessity of the warrior monk. The order's revenues, which depended on landholdings or commanderies scattered across France, Spain, Portugal, the German states, and Italy were substantial but increasingly difficult to administer. The French knights, who had always formed the largest and most influential national contingent within the order, were deeply embedded in the aristocratic structures of the Bourbon monarchy. The membership had changed too, in ways that would prove catastrophic. By the late 18th century, the proportion of knights who were French had grown to something like 2/3 of the active membership. This was a structural problem dressed as an institutional achievement. The French knights were well-born, well-connected, culturally sophisticated, and, as events would demonstrate, not necessarily willing to fight other Frenchmen to defend a Mediterranean island for a cause that no longer commanded the same theological urgency it once had. Ferdinand von Hompesch zu Bolheim inherited all of this when he was elected Grand Master in 1797, the first German ever to hold the position, elected after a period of internal politics that had been, by the order's standards, particularly fraught. He served less than 18 months before the French fleet appeared on the horizon. The capitulation of 1798 has been read, consistently and almost universally, as the disgraceful collapse of a decadent institution. That reading is not wrong, but it is not complete. The order's rules of chivalric conduct explicitly prohibited knights from bearing arms against fellow Christians, and 2/3 of the knights were French. The garrison at Fort St. Elmo had included its proportion of men who had taken vows before the French Revolution and who found themselves, in June 1798, being asked to fire cannon at the armies of the Republic that had abolished the aristocratic order into which they were born and the monarchy they had served. Some refused. Some simply walked away from their posts. Some small engagements occurred. At Fort San Lucian, 165 men held a position for 36 hours until they ran out of water and ammunition. That is documented. The resistance was not zero, but the structural mathematics were impossible, and Hompesch understood it. He surrendered. He departed with the order's archives, its relics, and the right hand of St. John the Baptist, which the order had possessed since Rhodes. He departed without an island, without a future that he could clearly describe, and without, as it would turn out, much of a personal future either. He resigned the Grand Mastership 2 years later under pressure from the surviving knights and died in Montpellier in 1805, a man whose name history remembered primarily as the answer to the question of who lost Malta. The order, however, did not die with him. It did something more interesting and more difficult. It reinvented itself. But before the reinvention can be understood, the institution itself must be understood. Its structure, its membership, its rituals, the specific and peculiar architecture of what it actually was. Because the Order of Malta is not, and has never been, quite what the popular imagination makes of it. It is not a secret lodge. It is not an occult brotherhood. It is not a Masonic order with medieval dressing. It is something considerably stranger in its actual design. A Catholic religious order with vows and a rule and a theology that simultaneously claims and is granted the rights of a sovereign state, and that has built, across 9 centuries, a set of institutional practices so layered and specific that even its critics and its enthusiasts tend to misread them in the same direction. The structure begins with the vows. At the core of the Order of Malta, the innermost layer of an institution that has accumulated layers across 9 centuries, there are, as of the most recent published figures, 33 people. 33 Knights of Justice, also called professed knights, who have taken the full religious vows of a Catholic religious order: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Not the symbolic poverty of a man who has signed his assets to a trust. Not the ceremonial chastity of a layman who attends Mass on Sundays. Full vows of the kind that bind a Franciscan or a Benedictine, canonical vows recognized by the Catholic Church and subject to its discipline. These 33 men, and they have been, historically, men, though the 2022 constitutional reform opened the possibility of change, are the religious heart of what the popular imagination sees as a secret world power. They are the true monks of the order, the inner sanctum from which the Grand Master and the senior governing officials have traditionally been drawn. Around them, in a series of expanding concentric rings, are the other 13,000 and some members of the institution. The second class consists of knights and dames in obedience, individuals who have made a formal promise of obedience to the order without taking the full canonical vows. Within this class, there are further gradations, historically of some significance: knights and dames of honor and devotion, who were for centuries required to demonstrate 4 generations of noble ancestry, and knights and dames of grace and devotion, who could be admitted without the noble lineage requirement through special dispensation. The second class, as of the most recent published figures, numbers several hundred individuals globally, a small group by any ordinary standard, but a substantial concentration of Catholic aristocracy, senior jurists, diplomats, and philanthropists by the standards of any voluntary organization. The third class is largest and in some ways most representative of what the order has become. Approximately 12,000 members who live according to the order's principles, serve its humanitarian mission, and belong to one of its 50-odd national associations around the world without vows, without the promise of obedience, and without, in most cases, the noble lineage that once defined admission to the higher classes. This is the order as a Catholic service organization on a global scale, serious in its commitments, impressive in its reach, and not meaningfully secret in its operations. For nearly all of its modern history, the highest ranks of the order were formally closed to anyone who could not prove noble birth. 4 generations of nobility was the requirement for knights of honor and devotion, and all Grand Masters and senior officials were drawn from this class. The requirement was not a merely ceremonial one. It was enforced, documented, and deeply resistant to reform. It connected the order in a direct and institutional line to the aristocratic world of pre-revolutionary Europe, the world of the French knights who deserted their posts in 1798, the world of the Bourbon monarchy that vanished in the same decade, the world that the 20th century spent most of its energy dismantling. Pope Francis dismantled what remained of it in September 2022. The new constitutional charter, promulgated on the 3rd of September 2022, removed the noble birth requirement entirely, not just modified it, not just created new exemptions, but eliminated it as a criterion for any class of membership or any office, including the office of Grand Master. The document also restructured the Grand Mastership itself. Where the position had previously been held for life, it would now be held for 10-year terms renewable once, with a mandatory retirement age of 85. The order, that had been governed by hereditary European aristocrats since its founding, would now, for the first time in its history, be able to elect anyone. On May 3, 2023, the order demonstrated that it meant what it said. Fra John T. Dunlap was born in Canada on April 16, 1957. He is a corporate and immigration lawyer by training, a man whose career was built in boardrooms and courtrooms rather than in the palaces and castles of European aristocracy. He joined the order in 1996 and took his solemn vows as a professed Knight of Justice in 2008. He had served for years as a legal advisor to the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See, to the United Nations. When the Council Complete of State met in Rome on May 3, 2023, and elected him the 81st Grand Master of the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta, he became the first non-European Grand Master in the order's recorded history, and the first Grand Master without any claim to noble ancestry. The warrior monks who built Crac des Chevaliers and bled through the summer of 1565 would likely have found this outcome incomprehensible. That is, in itself, a kind of measure of the distance the institution has traveled. The title that Dunlap now holds is, by any standard of institutional nomenclature, extraordinary. He is addressed as His Most Eminent Highness the Prince and Grand Master. Prince for the sovereign function, Grand Master for the religious and military one. The rank of Prince carries with it under the order's own constitution, and under the diplomatic protocols of the states that maintain relations with it, the treatment due to a head of state. The religious title carries with it, under Catholic canon law, the rank equivalent to that of a cardinal of the Church. He is simultaneously a religious superior and a sovereign. No other person on earth holds quite this combination of titles in quite this form. The symbol he would have received upon his investiture, the symbol that has marked the order's identity since its earliest military period, is the 8-pointed white cross on a black field. Popular culture calls it the Maltese cross, though the order used it long before it came to Malta. The 8 points in the order's official symbolism represent the 8 Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the merciful, and so forth. A theological encoding of the hospitaller vocation into a military emblem, the cross of soldiers carrying at its geometric extremities the promises of gentleness and mercy. Whether or not this symbolism was present at the cross's origin, it became the official interpretation, and it tells you something about how the order understood and presents itself, the sword and the hospital bed held together in the same sign. The initiation of a new member of the order is not and has never been an occult ceremony. This requires stating directly, because the popular literature on secret societies tends to project onto the order the kind of esoteric initiation it associates with Freemasonry or the Rosicrucians or any of a dozen other organizations whose ritual life is genuinely mysterious. The Order of Malta does not have a hidden cosmology. It does not have a secret theology. Its initiation is a Catholic Mass, followed by a formal investiture ceremony in which the new member receives the cross of the order and takes whatever commitment, vow, promise, or pledge corresponds to the class they are entering. The ceremony is religious in the straightforward Catholic sense. There is a priest, there is a liturgy, there is a cross. There is no esoteric content, no secret word, no hidden degree. The secrecy around the order is of a different and more institutional kind. It is the secrecy of deliberation, the council complete of state. The bodies that govern the order meet without publishing transcripts or minutes. The finances of the sovereign entity are not publicly disclosed. The membership lists of the higher classes are not published in any official registry available to general inquiry. These are the kinds of opacity that attach to any institution that understands itself as a state. The Vatican does not publish its investment portfolio, the British royal household does not release its internal deliberations, and they create exactly the interpretive void that conspiracy theories are designed to fill. But the actual governing structure is documented in its outlines. The Grand Master governs with a sovereign council, a body of senior officials elected by the General Chapter, the Order's representative assembly, and serving alongside officials of the Grand Master's appointment. There is a Secretary General. There is a Grand Hospitaller overseeing humanitarian activities. There is a Receiver of the Common Treasury overseeing finances. The General Chapter meets every 5 years in ordinary session to review the Order's direction and elect officials. This is, in its essential architecture, not unlike the governance of a small state or a major religious organization, hierarchical, deliberate, and conservative in its procedural instincts. The two headquarters buildings in Rome deserve attention precisely because so much of what makes the order strange concentrates in their legal status. The Palazzo Malta, on the Via dei Condotti, one of Rome's most expensive shopping streets, a detail the order's literature tends to omit, is the residence of the Grand Master and the seat of the order's government. The Villa del Priorato di Malta on the Aventine Hill is the seat of the Grand Priory of Rome and contains the famous keyhole through which, if you look through the wrought iron gates of the garden entrance, you see a perfectly framed view of the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, a piece of accidental or deliberate architectural theater that has made it one of Rome's most visited and most photographed minor curiosities. Both properties have been granted extraterritorial status by Italy under an agreement dating to 1869. This means that Italian law does not apply within their walls in the same way it applies to the surrounding street. The order's police do not patrol the Via dei Condotti. Italian tax authorities do not assess the Palazzo Malta's books. The arrangement is described in the official diplomatic language as a condition in which Italian sovereignty and the sovereignty of the order coexist without overlapping, a phrase that manages to sound both precise and entirely uninformative at the same time. What it produces, in practical terms, is this. The order issues its own passports from a building in Rome that is not, for certain defined purposes, part of Rome. Those passports, diplomatic passports for the Grand Master, Sovereign Council, and heads of diplomatic missions, service or humanitarian passports for field workers in dangerous territories, are recognized by the states with which the order has diplomatic relations. They are not widely distributed. They are not given to ordinary members of the order. A knight in the third class, living in Chicago or São Paulo or Nairobi, is not entitled to an Order of Malta passport. The passports go to the small number of people actually conducting the order's governmental and diplomatic functions. The order also issues stamps. The Poste Magistrali is the order's postal service, established in 1966, which issues commemorative stamps that are valid for postage on mail sent from the order's own extraterritorial premises. Philatelists collect them. The order issues coins in the scudo denomination. One scudo has been pegged informally to a fraction of the euro, which function primarily as collector items. It issues vehicle license plates. The number of vehicles bearing these plates in the traffic of Rome is not large. All of this, the passports, the stamps, the coins, the license plates, the extraterritorial buildings, can be read as either the coherent apparatus of a genuine sovereign entity or as an elaborate performance of sovereignty that substitutes symbols for the substance it cannot have, depending on your framework for what sovereignty actually requires. International legal scholars have been debating which reading is correct for more than a century. The Montevideo Convention of 1933, the document that most international law uses as a starting point for defining statehood, requires four things: a permanent population, a defined territory, an effective government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. The order clearly has the last two. It governs itself and it conducts diplomacy. It clearly lacks the first two. It has no permanent population in the ordinary sense and no defined territory since 1798. Whether it meets the criteria is, depending on which jurist you ask, either a settled question of sui generis sovereign status or an unresolved tension in the theory of international law that the order's political usefulness has simply allowed to remain unresolved. Most serious international lawyers land somewhere in the middle. The order is a genuinely unusual entity, not equivalent to a conventional state, but not a fiction either, whose functional sovereignty, its ability to do the things sovereign entities do, has been sufficient to sustain diplomatic recognition across 2 centuries of a world that has otherwise been aggressively reorganizing itself around the nation-state model. It has survived not by being right in the strict legal sense. It has survived by being useful. And to understand the full dimensions of that usefulness and the power it generated, you have to understand what the order actually did between its expulsion from Malta in 1798 and its formal reestablishment in Rome in 1834, a period of 36 years that, in its chaos and its improbable turns, tells you more about the institution's real nature than any of the centuries of military glory that preceded it. The years between 1798 and 1834 are not the years that get depicted in the documentaries or lingered over in the popular histories, and the reason for that omission is understandable. They are confusing, undignified, and do not fit neatly into any narrative that the order's admirers or its critics prefer. The admirers prefer the heroism of the Great Siege or the diplomatic ingenuity of the modern era. The critics prefer the decadence of the Napoleon capitulation as a final verdict. What actually happened in between is more revealing than either story, because it shows in unusually clear relief exactly what the order was made of when stripped of its fortress and its treasury and its purpose, and what it chose to become when it had the chance to choose. After the departure from Malta, Hompesch took what remained of the order's central administration to Trieste. The surviving knights were scattered across Europe, demoralized, politically compromised in France by the Revolution, and elsewhere by their association with the old aristocratic order that the revolutionary tide was dismantling everywhere it reached. The order had lost approximately half its revenue base in 1792, when the French revolutionary government stripped its French commanderies, land holdings that had supported the largest and wealthiest single national contingent of the order for centuries. By 1798, it was already seriously impoverished before Napoleon took the island. What happened next is one of the stranger episodes in the history of Catholic institutions. Tsar Paul I of Russia was a complicated man, genuinely pious in an eccentric way, intensely romantic about medieval chivalry, and politically furious at the French Republic, which he saw as the principal threat to European order. He had been named protector of the order's Russian associations in 1797. When news of the Malta capitulation reached St. Petersburg, he reacted with a combination of outrage and opportunity. A faction of the knights in Russia, under circumstances that the order's own records describe as canonically irregular, elected Paul I Grand Master in 1799. The problem was multifold. Paul I was not Catholic, he was Russian Orthodox. The order's rules required the Grand Master to be a professed Catholic knight. The election had not been conducted with the full participation of the surviving international membership, and the Pope, Pius VI, who was himself at this point a prisoner of the French. He would die in French captivity in 1799, had not recognized the election. The Holy See never did recognize Paul I as Grand Master, despite diplomatic pressure from St. Petersburg. The Tsar's Grand Mastership is documented as a historical fact. It is simultaneously documented as canonically invalid by the order's own subsequent determinations. Paul I was assassinated in March 1801, strangled in his bedroom by officers of the Imperial Guard in a palace coup that his own son Alexander may or may not have sanctioned. The Russian chapter of the order's history ended with his death, though Russian associations would maintain a connection to the order's heritage for another generation. The order then underwent a formal process of reconstituting its legitimate governance, electing a new Grand Master, and appealing once more to the Catholic powers of Europe for territorial support. The appeal produced the same result as it always had: sympathy, hospitality, and no territory. The order moved to Catania, then to Messina, then to Ferrara, then to Rome. It was received as a guest of the Pope. It occupied buildings provided by the Holy See. It administered what remained of its revenues from commanderies in the German states, in Spain, and in Portugal. It maintained its diplomatic pretensions with the exhausted persistence of an institution that had nothing left to trade on but its history and its name. In 1834, the order formally established its headquarters at the Palazzo Malta in Rome, adopted its current official name, the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta, and committed itself to a reinvention that was, in retrospect, one of the more successful institutional pivots of the 19th century. The pivot was back to the beginning, to the hospital in Jerusalem, to Blessed Gerard, to the thing the order had been before it acquired castles and navies and the territorial ambitions that made their loss so catastrophic. The hospitaller mission, care for the sick, support for the poor, medical services in conditions of conflict and disaster, was not only morally coherent and theologically unimpeachable, it was also, by the standards of the 19th century's emerging international humanitarian framework, genuinely useful in a way that a remnant crusading force was not. The world did not need the order to fight anyone. It might, the leadership slowly concluded, need the order to run field hospitals. Italy recognized the extraterritoriality of the Palazzo Malta in 1869, formalizing an arrangement that had been operating in practice for decades. The order began rebuilding its network of national associations, establishing formal bodies in Austria, Germany, France, England, and eventually dozens of other countries, each raising funds domestically and conducting charitable activities according to the order's hospitaller mission. In 1948, the Italian Republic and the order signed a formal treaty confirming the earlier extraterritoriality arrangements. The Via del Priorato di Malta on the Aventine Hill was added to the extraterritorial properties. The diplomatic recognition came gradually. Then, as the 20th century progressed and the order's humanitarian activities expanded more quickly, countries that maintained no particular religious sympathy for a Catholic chivalric order found that diplomatic relations with the order cost nothing and provided in the order's field hospital networks and disaster relief operations a certain operational value that more expensive partnerships required more money to achieve. By the time the United Nations General Assembly voted on August 24, 1994, to grant the order permanent observer status, 104 states had already established formal diplomatic relations. The UN observer status is worth pausing on because it is often misunderstood in both directions, overstated as proof of full sovereignty, dismissed as a meaningless honorific. The General Assembly's observer category is not membership. The order cannot vote in the General Assembly. It does not have a seat on the Security Council. What it has is the right to participate in General Assembly sessions and work, to speak in debate, to be present in the institutional life of the United Nations without having the obligations of member state status. It shares this category with the International Olympic Committee, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and a handful of other entities that the General Assembly has determined are sufficiently important to international life to warrant formal inclusion in its proceedings. The comparison to the ICRC is instructive. The International Committee of the Red Cross is also a private Swiss association with extraordinary diplomatic recognition. It also holds UN observer status. It also operates in conflict and disaster zones with a humanitarian mandate. The difference is that the ICRC does not claim sovereignty. The order does, and that claim is what makes it, legally and philosophically, genuinely unlike anything else in the international system. What the order does with its sovereignty, day to day, is largely what Malteser International does on the ground. Malteser International is the order's global humanitarian relief arm, formally named in 2005, operating in approximately 33 countries with more than 980 staff, the majority of them local nationals in the countries where they work, and approximately 100 active projects spanning Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. The organization has, by its own most recent published figures, reached more than 8 million people with humanitarian assistance, including 700,000 refugees. It deploys field hospitals in disaster zones, conducts emergency relief after earthquakes and floods and conflicts, and runs long-term development programs in areas that attract less journalistic attention than acute crises. This is what the order actually does at scale in the present day. Not the passports, not the stamps, not the extraterritorial buildings in Rome, though those are real. Not the CIA connections, which we will come to. Not the world government function, which we will also come to and dispatch. The actual operational activity of the institution is medical and humanitarian, and by the standards of international NGOs, it is substantial, professionally conducted, and documented in public reporting that is available to anyone who asks. The membership, those 13,000 and some knights and dames, distributed across 50 national associations, funds, and supports this work through dues, donations, and volunteer service. They attend Mass together. They run charity events. Some of them serve in field operations. The ordinary experience of membership in the Order of Malta is, for most of those 13,000 people, the experience of belonging to a serious, well-organized Catholic service organization with a remarkable history and an unusual claim to sovereignty that they probably do not think about very often. And then there is the inner layer. Those 33 Knights of Justice, the Grand Master, the Sovereign Council, the two buildings in Rome that are not quite Italian territory. And it is that layer, its opacity, its genuine strangeness, and its documented adjacency to the intelligence and diplomatic worlds of the 20th century that generates the stories. The stories are worth examining directly because some of them contain real elements and some of them do not, and the distinction matters for understanding what the order actually is. In the years immediately following the Second World War, the order found itself, like many Catholic institutions, navigating the extraordinary wreckage of European civilization with a combination of genuine humanitarian purpose and institutional interest that did not always point in the same direction. The order's anti-communist orientation was unambiguous. A Catholic aristocratic institution founded on crusading theology had no natural sympathy for Soviet materialism, and that orientation aligned it broadly and genuinely with the emerging Western Cold War consensus. What is documented specifically is this: Baron Luigi Perilli, an Italian aristocrat and Knight of Malta, served as an intermediary in 1944 and 1945 between SS officers in northern Italy and Alan Dulles, the senior OSS representative in Switzerland. The operation, known as Sunrise, resulted in the surrender of German forces in Italy in May 1945, ahead of the general German capitulation. Perilli's involvement in this negotiation is documented. That he was a Knight of Malta is documented. That his membership in the order was the mechanism by which the OSS made contact with SS officers is not established by the available record. He was a well-connected Italian aristocrat who moved in the circles where such contacts were made, and the order was one of several institutions that gave him that standing. This documented episode, a Knight of Malta serving as a go-between in a wartime intelligence negotiation, is the seed from which a much larger and much less documented edifice has been constructed. The claim, as it circulates in the conspiracy literature, runs roughly as follows: that the CIA was founded by and is controlled by Knights of Malta, that William Donovan, Alan Dulles, John McCone, and William Casey were all members of the order, that the order therefore serves as a Vatican-directed intelligence directorate operating inside the American national security apparatus, and that through this mechanism, the order exercises real, hidden power over Western foreign policy. The question of what the record actually shows is worth asking carefully, because the answer is not simple dismissal. William Donovan, who founded the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence organization that became the predecessor to the CIA, was a devout Irish Catholic and a man of considerable Vatican connections. He received the Grand Cross of the Order of St. Sylvester from Pope Pius XII in 1944, a high papal honor. He was in contact with Vatican networks during the war when those networks provided intelligence about conditions in occupied Europe that no other source could match. He is frequently described in conspiracy-oriented literature as a Knight of Malta. The academic histories of the OSS and the CIA do not confirm this membership. The primary sources that assert it are not peer-reviewed scholarly works. The claim exists in the same literature that makes the broader CIA control argument, and its sourcing, when traced, leads back to the same small number of self-referential texts cycling through the same unverified assertions. Alan Dulles is the more interesting case because what is documented about him requires less embellishment than the embellishers tend to provide. Dulles ran OSS operations in Switzerland during the war. He cultivated Vatican contacts as intelligence assets, the Holy See's diplomatic network, which maintained relations with both Axis and Allied powers throughout the conflict, was genuinely valuable to any intelligence service that could access it. Baron Perilli, the Knight of Malta, was one of his contacts. After the war, Dulles became the first civilian director of Central Intelligence, serving from 1953 to 1961. He was deeply Catholic in his social networks, if not in his personal conduct. Whether he was formally a Knight of Malta is, in the documentary record that historians have been able to access, unconfirmed. John McCone, CIA director from 1961 to 1965, was Catholic, a prominent lay Catholic philanthropist, and is cited in conspiracy literature as a Knight of Malta. The institutional records available to historians do not confirm the membership with the clarity that the conspiracy literature assumes. William Casey, CIA director from 1981 to 1987, was Catholic. He attended Fordham University, a Jesuit institution, and deeply motivated by a Catholic anti-communist worldview that shaped his aggressive expansion of CIA operations in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and elsewhere during the Reagan years. His Knight of Malta membership is asserted frequently and confidently in the conspiracy literature. It is not confirmed in the peer-reviewed academic histories of the CYA or in the Order's own published documentation. The pattern here matters. What is documented: senior CIA figures who were Catholic, who moved in Catholic social circles, who maintained Vatican-adjacent networks, who shared the Order's deep institutional anti-communism. What is not documented: that the Order of Malta, as an institution, directed, coordinated, or controlled CIA operations, or that membership in the Order was the mechanism by which these individuals exercised the influence they unquestionably did exercise. The leap from overlap of membership and worldview to organizational command and control structure is not a small one. It is, in fact, the fundamental logical error that runs through nearly all versions of this argument. Shared social background, shared religious affiliation, shared political orientation, these things are real and they have real effects on how institutions relate to each other, but they are not the same as institutional subordination. The CIA did not report to Rome. The CIA's Catholic directors did not receive their operational orders from the Palazzo Malta. The convergence of Cold War anti-communism between the Order, the Vatican, and the American national security establishment was genuine. The conspiratorial inference that it therefore constituted a hidden chain of command is not supported by the evidence that has actually been examined. There is one area where the record is more complicated, and it deserves direct acknowledgement. In the years immediately following the Second World War, certain networks operating in the margins of Vatican and Catholic institutional life assisted in the passage of individuals, some of them Nazi war criminals, from Europe to South America and elsewhere. The phenomenon is documented in serious scholarship, including work by historians Gerald Steinecker and Mark Ahrens and John Loftus. The mechanisms involved included forged or improperly issued travel documents, the cooperation of individual Catholic clergy who believed they were aiding anti-communists rather than war criminals, and organizations operating under the broad umbrella of Catholic charitable structures. Whether the Order of Malta as an institution bore organizational responsibility for this, or whether it was individual knights and Vatican-adjacent operators acting without the Order's institutional sanction, is a question that serious historians describe as contested. What is not contested is that the Order's name and some of its documentation infrastructure were misused in this period. What is also not contested is that the anti-communist orientation of the post-war Catholic world created conditions in which such misuse was possible, in which ideological solidarity with the enemies of Bolshevism could override other moral considerations, with results that the historical record makes difficult to read. The Order does not prominently discuss this period in its official histories, and then there are the theories that move beyond the documented complexity into something that is not historical analysis at all. The Black nobility theory, as it circulates in the online spaces where such things are traded, holds that a network of ancient European Catholic aristocratic families, primarily Italian, but extending to Spain, Austria, and beyond, secretly controls Western finance, Western governments, and Western intelligence services through interlocking memberships in institutions including the Order of Malta, the Jesuits, Opus Dei, and various banking families. The theory is articulated with considerable variation in its details, but its essential structure is consistent: a hidden Catholic elite pulling the strings of visible power, operating behind the facade of democratic institutions and free markets. It is important to be precise about what is wrong with this theory because the precision matters. What is wrong with it is not that European Catholic aristocratic families lack influence, or that Catholic institutions lack political networks, or that the Order of Malta has never been used by powerful people to advance interests that were not purely charitable. All of those things have elements of truth in them. European Catholic aristocracy has historically concentrated social capital. Catholic institutions do maintain networks that intersect with political and financial power. The Order's membership has included and includes people of considerable secular influence. None of this is contested. What is wrong with the black nobility theory is the conspiratorial architecture it imposes on these documented facts. The claim that the influence is secret, coordinated, directive, and world historical in scale. The claim that visible institutions are facades for hidden ones. The claim that what looks like pluralism and competition in Western societies is in fact the choreography of a single hidden network. This claim has no documentary support in any peer-reviewed scholarship. It exists in a genre of literature that is self-referential, unfalsifiable by design, and structurally similar to, in many cases overlapping with, or in some instances derived from, the anti-Semitic conspiracy tradition that attributed the same hidden world control to Jewish banking families, to Masonic lodges, to the protocols of the Elders of Zion. That last point requires stating plainly, because the connection is not incidental. The structure of the black nobility and Knights of Malta world control narrative is, in many of its historical variants, an adaptation of the protocols of the Elders model, a claim that a small, secretive group with distinctive religious and ethnic markers secretly controls the levers of world power. In some versions of the theory, the Catholic elite are the visible managers of a deeper Jewish financial conspiracy. In other versions, they are the alternative explanation offered by anti-Catholic authors who substitute papal plots for the Zionist plots in the original anti-Semitic template. In either case, the conspiratorial logic is the same logic, and the evidence base is the same evidence base, which is to say, none. This is part of what makes the history of the Order of Malta unusual, and part of what makes responsible treatment of it genuinely difficult. The institution sits at a confluence of real power, real opacity, real historical entanglement with intelligence services, and real aristocratic exclusivity. And that confluence generates conspiracy theories from multiple directions, some of them carrying ideological freight that is considerably more dangerous than the theories themselves. The rule of this kind of storytelling is straightforward. The documented facts about the Order of Malta are strange enough. They do not require embellishment, and the embellishments that do circulate are not simply wrong in the epistemological sense. They are, in their most developed forms, connected to a tradition of conspiratorial thinking that has historically generated violence. This is the part the popular story tends to get wrong. The popular story about the Knights of Malta is not that they are irrelevant or uninteresting. The popular story is that their relevance is hidden, that their interest is occult in the strict sense, that the real story is concealed beneath the surface. And what the actual record shows is almost the opposite. The real story is visible, documented, strange in ways that require no invention, and considerably more illuminating about how power actually works than the conspiracy literature manages to be. Power, the documented history of the Order suggests, does not primarily work through secret command structures. It works through the accumulation and maintenance of legitimacy over very long time scales. It works through being useful to the people who can grant or withdraw recognition. It works through the slow cultivation of a reputation that makes dissolution more inconvenient than continuation. The Order of Malta survived Napoleon because it had diplomatic relations. It survived the 19th century because it had a humanitarian mission. It survived the 20th century because it had both, plus a Cold War anti-communist usefulness that aligned it with the most powerful state in the world. It is currently surviving the 21st century by electing a Canadian lawyer as its Grand Master and letting the Pope rewrite its constitution. None of that requires a secret. All of it requires patience, adaptability, and a very long institutional memory. Which brings us finally to the crisis that made all of this visible in a way that the Order had spent decades successfully avoiding. In December 2016, Grand Master Matthew Festing summoned his Grand Chancellor, Albrecht von Busselager, and dismissed him. The issue, as stated by Festing and the officials who supported him, was the distribution of contraceptives by Malteser International in certain developing country health programs, specifically in Myanmar, where the humanitarian arm had provided condoms as part of HIV prevention work. The Order's constitutional position, reflecting its Catholic identity, was that contraception was impermissible. Busselager's position, and the position of much of the humanitarian staff, was that in the field conditions of a developing country HIV crisis, this theological stance had lethal consequences. Cardinal Raymond Burke, the Order's cardinal patron and one of the most prominent conservative voices in the contemporary Catholic Church, was present at the dismissal. This detail is significant. The dismissal of Busselager was not an impulsive act by a Grand Master acting alone. It was a coordinated move with support from a faction within the Vatican that saw the contraceptive distribution as a doctrinal breach requiring correction. Pope Francis saw it differently. Francis is not a pope who leaves internal church power struggles to resolve themselves. He appointed Cardinal Angelo Becciu as his special delegate to investigate the dismissal. The investigation's findings supported Busselager. In January 2017, the Pope made clear that he expected Festing to resign. Festing resigned on January 24, 2017. The episode was brief, measured in weeks from beginning to end, but what it exposed was extraordinary in its implications for the Order's sovereignty claim. For 2 centuries, the Order had maintained diplomatic relations with more than 100 states on the basis of its sovereign status, a status that implied at minimum that its internal governance was its own business and not subject to external intervention. The Pope intervened in its internal governance. The Grand Master resigned at the Pope's direction. The canonical relationship between the Order and the Holy See, the relationship established in the Bull of 1113, the Order answers to Rome and to no one else, had just demonstrated in public and in real time that answering to Rome could mean a sitting pope directing the resignation of the head of another sovereign entity. Busselager was reinstated as Grand Chancellor. A 6-year process of Vatican-supervised constitutional reform followed. The reform process that followed was the most extensive restructuring of the Order's governance in its modern history, overseen by Cardinal Silvano Tomasi as the Vatican's special delegate and conducted under the evident supervision — oversight is perhaps the more accurate word — of a pope who had already demonstrated his willingness to intervene directly in the Order's internal affairs and his ability to see that intervention through to a result. The new constitutional charter was promulgated on September 3, 2022. Its changes were structural and, for an institution of 900 years, revolutionary in their implications. The noble birth requirement, which had governed admission to the highest classes and eligibility for the highest office since the Order's medieval origins, was eliminated entirely. The Grand Mastership, previously held for life, was restructured as a 10-year term renewable once, with mandatory retirement at 85. The requirement that the Grand Master be drawn from the professed Knights of Justice was retained, but since professed knighthood was itself now open to men without noble lineage, the effective restriction had been dissolved. The Order was being democratized. Carefully, institutionally, at the Vatican's direction, but democratized nonetheless. The question was whether the institution that emerged from this process would still be recognizably the same institution that had defended Crac des Chevaliers, survived the Great Siege, lost Malta, and reinvented itself in 2 buildings in Rome. The Council Complete of State answered that question in a particular way on May 3, 2023. Fra John T. Dunlap was 16 days past his 66th birthday when the vote was cast. A Canadian lawyer, a man whose career had been built in the specialized corridors of corporate and immigration law, who had joined the order in 1996 and taken his solemn vows as a professed Knight of Justice in 2008, who had spent years as a legal advisor to the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations in New York, a position that is, in its own way, a perfect encapsulation of everything the order has become, the intersection of Catholic institutional life and international diplomatic machinery. He is the 81st Grand Master, the first non-European, the first without noble lineage. He sits in the Palazzo Malta on the Via dei Condotti, in a building that is not quite Italian territory, and holds a title that is not quite like any other title on earth, and governs a body that is not quite like any other body in international life. And the 900 years of history that underwrite his position are, depending on how you read them, either the most remarkable story of institutional survival in the Western world or the most elaborate performance of it. Both readings may be true. This is the part that the popular stories in either direction, the hagiographic and the conspiratorial alike, tend to miss. The Order of Malta is not great because it is secretly powerful. It is not sinister because it is exclusively Catholic and aristocratic. It is not a fiction because it lacks territory. It is something considerably more specific and more interesting than any of those framings. It is an institution that has persisted across nearly a millennium by being genuinely willing to abandon everything except the core of what it claimed to be, which was an organization whose purpose was the relief of suffering and the maintenance of a particular kind of Catholic Christian identity within the international system. It lost Jerusalem, it lost Rhodes, it lost Malta, it lost the French commanderies, the Spanish commanderies, the Italian landholdings that had financed its operations for centuries. It lost a Grand Master to Napoleon's logistical mathematics. It nearly lost its governance to an irregular Russian czar. It lost its noble birth requirement to a pope with a social justice agenda and a willingness to use the authority of the 1113 bull in ways its authors never anticipated. What it has not lost in 900 years is the legal and diplomatic architecture that connects it to the international system. And that architecture has proven, as it turns out, more durable than castles. The conspiracy theories that surround it are, in this light, a kind of tribute. They are what happens when an institution is genuinely strange and genuinely opaque and genuinely connected to power, and the people observing it from the outside reach for the largest explanation available. The CIA was run by its members. The black nobility coordinates world finance through its boardrooms. The Pope and the Grand Master between them pull levers that presidents cannot find. These theories are wrong in their specifics and wrong in their structural logic. They substitute the drama of hidden command for the more interesting and more verifiable story of accumulated legitimacy and very long-term institutional patience. But they are responding to something real, which is that the Order of Malta occupies a position in the international system that is genuinely unusual, genuinely unaccountable by the standards of democratic transparency, and genuinely connected to networks of Catholic aristocratic influence that have never fully dissolved. All of those descriptions contain some truth. None contains the whole of it. The whole of it requires sitting with the strangeness without reaching for the simplifying frame. It requires looking at two buildings on the streets of Rome and accepting that they are, for defined purposes, not quite Italian territory. It requires accepting that a Canadian lawyer with no noble ancestry is simultaneously a prince and a cardinal, and the head of a 900-year-old military order that has not fought a military engagement in over 2 centuries. It requires accepting that the institution he heads sends field hospitals into disaster zones, issues passports to a handful of diplomats, exchanges ambassadors with 114 countries, and still, on formal occasions, wears the 8-pointed white cross that the Knights of Raymond Dupuy wore on the walls of Jerusalem. Whether that sovereignty is real in the strict Montevideo Convention sense remains genuinely contested. Whether the intelligence community adjacency of the Cold War era represents deep institutional coordination or the social overlap of a small Catholic establishment world is, with the records available, not fully resolvable. Whether the order's opacity about its finances reflects a global financial empire or simply the normal institutional privacy of a religious body that does not consider itself subject to public financial disclosure requirements is a question the order itself has not chosen to answer. What is not contested is that on June 12, 1798, a Grand Master who had held the position for less than 18 months signed the document that handed Malta to Napoleon, and that the institution he led has existed continuously in the 2 centuries and more since that morning, has issued passports and postage stamps and coins and license plates and diplomas and humanitarian assistance and diplomatic notes, has been recognized by the United Nations and by 114 sovereign states, and has recently elected a man born in Canada to lead it. The Ottoman fleet that arrived in Malta's Grand Harbor in 1565 was larger than the French fleet of 1798. The defense that met it was longer, bloodier, and more celebrated. And then in 1798, the island was gone in 48 hours, and the institution survived. This is the thing that the Great Siege, magnificent as it was, cannot quite explain. Empires survive because they have armies and tax bases and population mass. Orders survive because they have something else, a function that powerful people continue to find useful, a name that carries enough accumulated legitimacy to make dissolution more trouble than continuation, and a willingness to become something different from what they were, while insisting quietly and persistently that they have been the same thing all along. On that June morning in 1798, as Hompesch's signature dried on the capitulation document, the sovereign military order of Malta lost the last piece of territory it will probably ever hold. What it gained, in the century and a half of patient institutional reinvention that followed, was something that territory cannot fully provide: the freedom to be defined entirely by what it does rather than where it stands. It stands today in 2 buildings. It does today the work of a hospital that was old before the Crusades. The cross is still 8-pointed. The name is still too long to say quickly. And whatever it is, a sovereign, a relic, a diplomatic anomaly, a genuine humanitarian force, or some layered combination of all 4, it is still unmistakably here. If histories like this one are what you come here for, subscribe. There is a new one every week.